Starting us off on this list, in at number 10, we have a teenager, Aaron Schmidt, who was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for murdering his 14-year-old neighbor, Elena Callahan. If for some reason Schmidt outlived his sentence, he will have an additional 5 years on his sentence. So that 5-year sentence will run consecutively after any other sentencing he might receive in the future for a possession charge. He will also have another 10 years of his sentence for theft, and again that's going to start after all of his other sentencing has been completed. After sentencing, it was actually appealed to the Georgia Supreme Court due to what in people's opinions were saying the sentence was cruel and an unusual punishment. But the judge rejected all the arguments in court and said he finds the evidence it was sufficient enough to find Schmidt guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of his crimes, and the punishment, it fit the crime. Number 9.
We have breaking team coverage this evening. One of the brothers accused of murdering his 5 family members in Broken Arrow will spend the rest of his life in prison.
This right here is 16-year-old Michael Beaver, who with his older brother Robert Beaver killed their parents and 3 siblings during a murder spree. Is this real life right now? This is just so messed up. So now, living a life without his parents, he will see the inside of a prison cell for the rest of his life. Beaver's 2 younger sisters, one being just 5 years old, was attacked in what was described as the worst single criminal event in the history of Broken Arrow City in Oklahoma. I mean, that is just so messed up. Beaver was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder for his role in the killings. His lawyer did try to defend Michael Beaver, saying that it was his older brother that planned and led the murder. His older brother he took a plea deal to his crimes and he was sentenced to life without parole. By pleading guilty, Michael's older brother Robert avoided the death penalty. Michael Beaver was also sentenced. His lawyers couldn't get him off the hook to this traumatizing event. Number 8.
Now at the heart of all of today's proceedings was the issue of parole. Judge Edward Lukemeyer, who's presiding over the case, said at the outset that the issue is determining whether White fits in what he called the narrow subset of juveniles who deserve a life sentence without parole.
Well, for teenager Dakota White, he fit the narrow subset of juveniles who deserves a life sentence without parole, according to a judge. It seemed like Dakota didn't feel remorse for what he has done during a few recording phone calls of him bragging about his murder that he committed. There didn't seem like a chance of rehabilitating this teenager, so that's when he was given the harsh sentence. During the trial, it only took jurors about 15 minutes to come up with the deliberation of guilty. He was found guilty of stabbing and strangling Sam Poss to death. He was just 17 years old at the time of the murder. Number 7. We have 17 years old at the time of his crime, Joseph Spencer. He pleaded guilty to 3 first-degree murder charges in the deaths of his parents, and this is during Labor Day weekend. Joseph went on a killing spree. He was given 2 life sentences after he was tried as an adult. He will have to serve 2 life sentences concurrently, so one after another. And then when that's done, he has to serve his 3rd sentence. Spencer's dad was a UPS pilot, his mom was a science teacher, and I'm pretty sure this kid deserves to never see the light of day. Moving into number 6, we have 14-year-old Colton Glenn Orr, and he was 14 at the time of his crime. He pleaded guilty for shooting and killing his father's fiancée, Laura Hendricks, and this took place in their home. He was sentenced to life in prison. Right after the murder took place, the teenager just walked into a police station and he confessed everything he has done. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that Orr should be tried as an adult, so he was given life in prison. Right now there are appeals to try to have this teen tried as a juvenile, but that's most likely going to be denied. Orr's lawyers are trying to argue that sexual abuse that was done to him was the reason that drove him to commit these awful crimes, but that was quickly discredited. At least now he's going to have a very long time to think about what he has done. Number 5.
Robert, we do begin with breaking news for our viewers in the West. We want to show you these pictures. Aerial shot of a middle school in Noblesville, Indiana. What has become a familiar scene. Students appear to be evacuating, running from their own school after reports that there has been a shooter there at Noblesville West Middle School.
Hearing about school shootings, it really upsets me, and I'm sure it upsets a lot of you guys. It seems way too common. Teens seem to be able to get their hands on guns like way too easily. There has to be some sort of gun control laws that makes it harder for citizens of America to get guns, or just even ban them altogether. I know it's a huge debate. There hasn't been a mass shooting in Australia who has banned guns like 20 years ago, but I know it would be close to impossible to ban all guns in America. Going back to the story, we have a 13-year-old in which his identity, we actually don't know it. He is a minor, so his identity is protected under the law, in which I think is kind of stupid when you think about it. This teen was capable of committing murder. Why then we're trying to protect him? Well, he will remain in the state's juvenile detention system until he's 18 years old, and then he's going to be transferred to an adult prison where he's going to serve out the rest of his sentence. Because he showed no remorse for what he has done, it's likely the teen will never leave prison. Moving into number 4, we have Taylor Lane Gwaltney, who was just 19 years old when he committed the murder, and then he bragged about it. The murder took place in Colorado Springs, where the teen attacked a homeless man with a baseball bat. The homeless man was 55-year-old Doyle, who was beaten to death. Doyle was discovered earlier that morning, partially wrapped in a sleeping bag. He had been hit on the head at least 4 to 7 times. During the trial, a 7-man, 5-woman jury took just 2 hours to convict him. The hearing trial did take 3 weeks, so the jury had to listen in onto some pretty horrifying details about the crime. Well, the teen was convicted of the murder and he was sentenced to life in prison, and he showed absolutely no remorse for what he has done. He bragged to 16 people about the murder. Well, at least he is now living in the right place for the rest of his life. Next up, number 3, we have 7-year-old Gavin Ramsey, who was just found guilty of 4 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of murder, 1 count of aggravated burglary, 1 count of kidnapping, and 1 count of gross abuse of a corpse. Is this real life right now? What does that even mean, gross abuse of a corpse? Let's not think about it. Well, Ramsey killed 98-year-old Margaret Douglas, which is just so sickening. I mean, poor woman who lived so long only to be murdered. This kid is just sick.
A sentence tonight for the Medina County teenager who broke into the home of a 98-year-old woman, videotaped her sleeping before killing her and abusing her body.
Ramsey was given life in prison.
He left in chains, where he'll remain for life without parole, for the teenager who robbed a 98-year-old from reaching her dream of 100.
Moving into number 2.
The court, having duly considered your offenses, it is hereby ordered that you be committed to the Department of Youth Services until the age of 21, and furthermore committed to the Massachusetts Correctional Institution at Cedar Junction for the period of not less than 25 years.
So that was Philip Chisholm at the age of 14 years old. He was found guilty on many charges. He raped and killed his 24-year-old math teacher. Chisholm was ordered to serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. He started his sentence at a juvenile facility. Once he turns 21 years old, he's then going to be transferred to a maximum adult prison where he will serve out the rest of his sentence. Chisholm was found guilty on many charges. He was sentenced to 25 years for premeditated murder. Once that sentence is complete, he will then have to serve another sentence of 40 years for armed robbery. Once that sentence is complete, so that's about 65 years at this point, he's going to have another 40-year sentence for armed robbery. After he's done that, he's going to have another 40-year sentence. And it's not done yet. After that sentence, if this teen is still alive at the age of 79 years old, he's going to have to serve his last sentence of rape. So that is another 40 years. This teen will have to become the world's oldest person to be able to be released from prison at the age of 119 years old. Finally, number 1, we have 10-year-old Antonio Barbo, who was charged with killing his great-grandmother in her Wisconsin home. He also had a friend help with the murder. Barbo and his friend decided to try to steal money from 78-year-old Barbara Olson, but things took a turn, and a robbery, it turned into a murder scene. They took turns beating her with a hatchet and hammer.
Sentencing was held today for a teenager convicted in a crime that rattled Sheboygan County and fiercely divided a family. Antonio Barbo learned he'll be a middle-aged man before he gets a chance at parole for killing his great-grandmother.
There doesn't seem to be much remorse, so I'm not sure if this kid will ever get out of prison. After Barbo and his friend committed the murder, they actually decided to go out and enjoy some pizza. These are not behaviors of remorse. Barbo's attorney was shocked when Barbo was given a life sentence. He believes that kids, especially at the age of just 10 years old, shouldn't be given a life sentence. But you know what? If you're capable of doing the crime, then I think you should be old enough, and capable enough to do the time.
Our statutes, the way they're standing right now, 10-year-old facing life in prison, I don't understand that. They aren't adults, they're children.
Dark list. In at number 10, we have Brian Lee Draper. Let me take you guys back to the night of September 22nd, 2006, where Brian Draper and his accomplice brutally murdered their classmate Cassie Stoddard for no apparent reason. They were hanging out with Cassie and her boyfriend on the night that Brian and his accomplice said that they were going to the theater to see a movie. As it turns out, they never went to the theater. They were hiding in the house waiting for Cassie's boyfriend to leave so that they can kill her. They turned the electricity off and stabbed the poor girl 30 times. During their trial, the two of them confessed to filming the entire plan. So here's a short clip of the two of them driving away from the scene of the crime.
I just killed Cassie. We just left her house. This is not a joke. I stabbed her in the throat and I saw her lifeless body just disappear. Dude, I just killed Cassie.
How sick and morbid is this? It just seems like they're so proud of what they've just done. Well, they were quickly picked up and interrogated, and they were arrested because their fake alibi fell through, and they were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Keep in mind that they were only 16 when they decided to brutally murder their friend. John Silva stabs his way onto this list at number 9. He was only 15 years old when he was convicted of first-degree murder after he strangled a 12-year-old boy and dumped his body in a septic tank. He was convicted of first-degree murder, and when he was sentenced to life in prison without parole, he didn't show any emotions. If he was an adult, he could have faced the death penalty because he even admitted to kidnapping his friend, forcing him to go to the woods, and then suffocating him to death. What a brutal crime. Even though he admitted to doing all of that, he never explained why he did it. So yeah, this guy sounds like a serial killer in the making. The police even found a note at the scene of the crime, and on that note it said list to prepare Jerry, and on the note it said strip to underwear, tie hands, gag and cover eyes. And like I said, he's a serial killer in the making, so maybe it's a good thing that he's gonna be behind bars for the rest of his life, because the world's gonna be a much safer place. Number 8 takes us to Joshua Phillips. He was convicted of life in prison without parole back in July of 1999, and that's after he murdered his 8-year-old neighbor when he was just 14 years old. He strangled, bludgeoned, and stabbed Maddie Clifton to death. He stuffed her lifeless body underneath his waterbed, but she wouldn't stay hidden for long. Joshua's mother came into his room days after the murder and found the dead body, which led him to confess to this murder. He said that they were playing basketball outside and he accidentally hit her on the head with his bat. He said he panicked and then killed her because he was scared of what his father would think. And I don't know, it seems like you killed her because you are a psychopath. This was no accident. Here's a clip of Joshua that was filmed 1 decade after the murder.
I'm going like, all right, well, maybe I did deserve to be here. Maybe I deserve to do as much time. Maybe I deserve to die in prison. But I always usually come back with the thought that I can't look at it like that, you know, and that doing that is just a cop-out and faking it. You know, you're just saying screw it, and why would I try to learn anything? Why would I try to improve myself? Why would I try to do anything to help anybody if I'm just gonna lay down and just die in here, you know?
Even though he might seem like he has changed, I feel like he is a textbook psychopath who knows the right things to say in order to look like a victim. The youngest American citizen to be sentenced to life in prison make their way onto this list at number 7. I'm talking about the notorious Lionel Tate, who was just 13 years old when he was convicted of first-degree murder.
To be the case, incarceration for your natural life. The now 14-year-old Lionel Tate was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Back on July 28, 1999, Lionel was left alone with a 6-year-old friend in the basement. The two of them were downstairs playing when all of a sudden Lionel came upstairs 45 minutes later to tell his mother that the little girl wasn't breathing. He said that they were wrestling and he had her in a headlock and then smashed her against the table. An autopsy revealed that he had stomped on her so hard that he actually lacerated her liver, fractured her skull and ribs, and her brain was very swollen. During the trial, the prosecution said that these injuries can be compared to falling from a 3-story building. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and the judge said that the acts of Lionel Tate were not the playful acts of a child. The acts of Lionel Tate were cold, callous, and cruel. Moving on to number 6, let's talk about Corvassier Sims.
A judge sentenced 17-year-old Corvassier Sims to 70 to 120 years in prison after pleading guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder and use of a weapon in their deaths.
Alright, I have to ask, is this real life right now? 70 to 120 years? I know that sounds insane, but I think the sentencing, it kind of fits this crime. He was only 15 years old when he shot 2 teenagers, ages 17 and 18 years old, while he was attempting to buy a gun off of them. It was decided that he'd be tried as an adult because he was involved in armed robberies and 2 homicides. Oh, and he was on probation during the murders for other crimes that he committed in the past. What? So yeah, I think it's safe to say that he is a repeat offender and he will most likely die behind bars because I don't think a parole board will ever grant him probation. At least I'm really hoping they don't. Rodrigo Caballero crawls onto this dark list at number 5. Rodrigo Caballero was sentenced to 110 years in prison when he was 16 years old, and he didn't even kill anyone. So how is this possible? Well, the 16-year-old fired several gunshots at 3 other teenagers, where one of them suffered from a non-fatal but serious injury. He was convicted of 3 counts of attempted murder, and each of those charges, they come with a minimum 15 year to life. And the judge also handed him special enhancements onto his sentencing for firing a gun belonging to a gang and greatly injuring one of the victims. When you add up all of these charges, you get 110 years. So technically, he isn't sentenced life to prison without parole. He will be eligible for parole when he's 126 years old, but most likely he is going to be dead before he makes it to his parole hearing. Up next, number 4, we have Gregory Brooks. He was 19 years old when he pleaded guilty to abducting and killing the parents of a former talk show host. Gregory Brooks and his accomplices beat them, stole $50, a rifle, jewelry, and other items, then they locked the couple in a closet. Later, one of the accomplices said he would return to the house to finish them off. The judge gave him 60 years for each of the 2 counts of murder and robbery charges, and just moments after he was sentenced to 120 years, his father told reporters that despite his son having a good, supportive upbringing, he was influenced by gang members with negative motives. Could you imagine being sentenced to 120 years in maximum prison at such a young age? Your whole life is just gone. He will literally die and rot behind bars for the rest of his life because of one stupid night. Moving up this list, at number 3, we're talking about Eddie Devine. This case is pretty intense, so prepare yourselves. He was only 13 years old at the time when him and his friend forced a woman into a car where they drove around for hours while they tortured and violated her with an ice pick. Thankfully, the woman was able to escape when the teenager stopped for gas, but she will be scarred for the rest of her life. Eddie Devine pleaded guilty to 2 counts of armed carjacking, 3 counts of armed robbery, 3 counts of kidnapping, and 2 counts of sexual battery. This kid isn't even old enough to go around the block by himself, and he's already committing all of these horrible crimes. To make things even worse, he told police that he was armed with a knife and he threatened to kill the woman before they stole her SUV. I'm pretty sure when I was 13, I was collecting Pokemon cards. I wasn't going around committing all these crimes. Eddie Devine did not get off lightly. He was sentenced to a total of 130 years in prison. Kenneth Young sneaks onto this list at number 2. He was only 14 years old when his mother's drug dealer forced him to get involved in a series of armed robberies. During one heist, Kenneth was caught, convicted, and sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences. So basically, he was sentenced to be thrown behind bars without ever having a chance of being released, and he didn't even injure or kill anyone. Let's hear from Kenneth Young.
Kenneth Young. First and foremost, Your Honor, I want to take the time out and say I take full responsibility for my actions and my role in these crimes. I have lived with regret every day as a civilized human being for these crimes. I have been incarcerated for 11 years, and I have taken advantage of every opportunity available for me in prison to better myself.
He was coerced into committing these crimes, and he was at such a young and impressionable age. I don't think he should have gotten this harsh sentence. Because of this young age and the severity of the sentence, he spent most of his time in solitary confinement until he reached 18 years old, where he was then transferred to an adult prison where he will grow old and die. And now at the top of our list, we've talked about him before. We actually did a whole docu-series of him. If you guys want to check that out, you guys can click right over here. It's called The Prison Life of Travion Blount. Well, Travion Blount makes it onto our list at number 1 for this video. Travion Blount was 15 years old when he robbed a party with 2 older gang members. Travion didn't hurt anyone, but he was found guilty of 49 counts, and eventually he was sentenced to 6 life sentences and an additional 118 years in prison. He knew he would be spending a few years in prison. He didn't expect to die in there. This has to be one of the harshest punishments in America for a teenager who didn't even commit homicide. Oh, and his accomplice, well, they only served 10 to 13 years in prison. I don't understand how this was even possible. Out of the 3 of them, Travion was the least involved, but he got the most time. After spending some time in prison, Travion finally got a glimpse of hope.
Received much lighter sentences.
Governor Bob McDonnell reduced Blount's sentence to 40 years, and today, Governor Terry McAuliffe cut it down to 14.
I mean, what the heck? His sentence was reduced from 6 life sentences plus 118 years to just 14 years. This makes me wonder what the heck was wrong with the original judge. I think his license should be put into question because I have no idea what was going through his mind. Maybe he was severely power tripping that day. He was just so pissed off. He's like, I'm giving you life, plus life, plus life, plus life, plus life, and plus life, and if that's not enough, plus 118 years, just in case. Dude, in at number 10, we have George Parrott, who was just 17 years old when he was arrested, and soon after he was convicted of rape and an assault that took place back in 1987. Well, George has spent 30 years in prison after it was deemed that he was actually wrongly convicted due to bogus FBI evidence.
He was convicted mainly on an FBI agent's testimony about a microscopic hair found in connection with the rape. But a judge found that evidence to be flawed and released Parrott on personal recognizance Wednesday.
This is why the justice system is just so messed up. A lot of times police officers or FBI agents are convinced, they're so convinced that this is the guy that committed the crime. So what they do is they do anything they can to get a conviction, to put this guy behind prison and to do it fast. Well, we have witnessed in the past them giving false statements, tampering with evidence, and a lot of times we have witnessed FBI agents and police officers get it wrong. They convicted the wrong person.
Did you ever lose hope after all those years?
No, absolutely. Of course, I've been in 30 years. A crime I didn't commit. Of course, I lost hope.
For people who may not have hope, what do you want them to know? He's got to pull out.
Don't give up. Don't give up. That's for sure. Don't give up.
All right, moving on this list, at number 9, we have 2 best friends, Ricky Jackson and Willie Bridgman. And they were arrested at the age of 16 years old for a murder that took place in Cleveland, Ohio. Harold Franks was the victim. Well, he was attacked with acid and he was shot twice with a .38 caliber gun. Both teenagers received the death penalty back in 1977, but it was later turned over to life imprisoned.
It was young Vernon's testimony that put Jackson on death row.
I could halfway accept my punishment if I was guilty, but, excuse me.
This story takes a huge turn because after spending 40 years behind bars, a judge released them, and the judge said they actually have the wrong people. Ricky and Willie were convicted after a false testimony that was given by a 12-year-old boy. These 2 friends didn't commit the crime, so for the past 40 years they were serving time for someone else's crime. Their lives has been taken away from them.
Words can't express how I feel right now. I'm just glad to be out, glad to be a free man.
What are you going to do today? Where are you going to go?
Wow. I mean, you know, you sit in prison for so long, you think about this day, but when it actually comes, you don't know what you just want to do something, you know?
This guy missed out on school, getting his first job, finding a wife, having kids. Being a teenager, you get to experience a lot of things in life, and it is a very important and crucial time in someone's life. Number 8, we have Howard Christensen. He is a Chicago native who became the nation's longest serving prisoner before he finally completed his time. At the age of 17 years old, old, Howard committed murder and was given a life sentence without parole to 200 years in prison. But that was later overturned to a 64-year prison sentence, which is pretty much life in prison. While Howard actually outlived his prison sentence and was able to see the light of day, well, just for a few years. Howard was 79 years old when he was finally released. Howard was only able to live 2 years as a free man before he passed away. Moving right along here, we have Bobby Bostic, and he comes onto our list at number 7. Bobby was just 16 years old when he was convicted of committing 17 crimes. Some of them include robbery and kidnapping. He fired a gun at 2 people. While he has been in prison for more than 20 years now, he is now in his 40s. Bobby on our list has one of the longest prison sentences. He was actually sentenced to 241 years. Many people believe that this was way too harsh for this crime. Murder was not committed, although there was near death. Back in 2010, the Supreme Court decided that their initial decision was unconstitutional and minors should have the opportunity to demonstrate maturity and rehabilitation. Even with that though, Bobby won't be eligible for parole until he's 112 years old. So if somehow he's able to outlive that, he has a chance of being a free man one day. Let's talk about a case I've paid close attention to. I've been very fascinated with it. Well, at number 6, let's talk about Brendan Dassey. Probably sounds familiar to you guys. I talk about him a whole lot. Well, he's a nephew of Stephen Avery, the guy from Making a Murder documentary. It's on Netflix.
How you doing, buddy?
Good.
Then they sat down with Brendan. Brendan's lawyers say investigators took advantage of him. Then just 16 years old and with a low IQ, manipulating him into making a false confession.
Brendan Dassey was just 16 years old when he was convicted of first-degree murder and second-degree sexual assault mutilation of a corpse. I believe Brendan Dassey is innocent and was framed. He was sentenced to life in prison with the earliest possibility of parole in 2048. So that's when Brendan Dassey turns 58 years old. Right now he's 28 years old. Stephen Avery, his uncle, is also still in prison and he has served 18 years for a crime he never committed. He was released, but then he was sentenced again for a new crime, and I don't believe he committed that either. I think he was framed by the same people who convicted him wrongly the first time. So in total, Stephen Avery has been in prison for 30 years, and you know what, I can't wait for season 2 of Making a Murderer to be released on Netflix because I need answers. And actually at number 5, let's talk about Stephen Avery a little bit more. He was also a teenager when he was first in prison. Stephen was 18 years old when he was convicted of sexual assault and attempted murder, and this was back in 1985. Like I said, after 18 years and after DNA testing became more available, it was proven that Stephen Avery was actually the wrong guy and evidence was tampered with by local police. He was serving a 30-year sentence.
Back home, relatives waited patiently. After 18 years, the last few hours were the longest, until finally, the reunion.
Too long though, too long. Oh God, I love you, baby.
Stephen Avery was only free for a few years until he was convicted for a murder. This was back in 2007 and he was given a life imprisonment sentence.
They keep on trying to do something with me. They're trying to find ends. They don't believe none of us. You know, whatever we say, they just don't. We're all liars.
And next up, number 4, we have 65-year-old Wilbert Jones, who was just 19 years old when he was sentenced to prison. He served 46 years for a crime that he didn't even commit. His conviction was just recently overturned. Back in 1971, Jones was found guilty of kidnapping and sexually assaulting a nurse in Louisiana. Apparently, authorities withheld evidence that could have exonerated Jones decades ago. I think this man should have been rewarded millions of dollars, although money won't give his life back. The state of Louisiana took away this man's life. I would be super upset in this situation, but for some reason Jones, he's just thankful for being free.
No, I forgave. You know what I'm saying? I forgive. Because the love of God and the Holy Spirit in my life, I don't have no bit in my life. I got to go the rest of my life.
Number 3, we have James Robertson, who actually inspired a new documentary on Netflix called I Am a Killer. I'm currently watching it and it's really good. I don't know why I'm so interested in these topics, but they just fascinate me. And I swear, if I wasn't a YouTuber, I'd want to get into criminal psychology or work for Netflix and create these documentaries. James Robertson has had a whole life of crime. He was just 16 years old when he was sent to prison, but his crime started at a much younger age. He grew up with a family that are alcoholics and abusive. Robert is currently in prison for a crime he committed back in 1980, and it was for theft. He has been in prison for the past 37 years. For 20 of those years, James Robertson was left in solitary confinement because he was hard to deal with. So for 23 hours in the day, he's stuck in a very tiny dark room. He doesn't get much visitations, actually I don't think he's allowed them at all, barely no sunlight, and when he does get out of his cell for 1 hour a day, he's in another small cage outside. So James couldn't take this anymore, so he decided to kill his new cellmate, who was a pedophile, because he wanted to be placed on death row. I mean, is this real life right now? While on death row, the rules are different. You actually get a bed to sleep on, you actually get more food to eat, you get medical care. Also, James didn't want to be in prison while he was older because he said, well, he's just going to become an easy target for people to beat up. So he just wants to leave the world. So crazy, because he was just trying to fight for the death penalty, but it took him a long time to actually get it, this is a very unusual request. Number 2, we have Joseph Ligon, who was just 15 years old when he was convicted of murdering 2 people back in 1953. Well, it's been 63 years since he was first sentenced to prison. Currently, Joseph is about 80 years old, and he has spent most of his life in a Philadelphia prison. He actually made it into the news a few years ago because he was given the chance of parole, but he turned it down. Joseph rejected this deal out of principle. He claims that he didn't kill anyone. It's really sad, and you know what? There are thousands of innocent people who are in prison serving times for crimes they didn't commit, and Joseph is probably one of them. Why would he choose to continue to fight for his innocence even when he could be released from prison? So now he is the longest serving juvenile lifer in the world that has been documented. And finally, we have made it to number 1. We have Paul Geidel Jr. And he is known to have served the longest prison sentence in the United States. Back in 1911, Paul was convicted of second-degree murder at the age of 17 years old. When Paul was released from prison, he was 86 years old, meaning he was in prison for 68 years. He was locked away in many different New York State prisons. Paul lived to see the day when he was actually released from prison. When Paul was paroled from prison, he didn't want to leave because that was the only life that he knew. He would probably go into shell shock because the world, it just changes so fast. He was in prison from 1911 to 1979. So let me tell you guys quickly what was invented during that time. So just to name a few, we had radio broadcasting, helicopters, microwaves, ovens, credit cards, widescreen cinemas, videotape recorders, video games, man went to space, computers were a new thing, and I mean all of those things. If you lived in prison, you probably never had any access to any of them. I don't even know if you get newspapers or if you read about it. A new computer, well, what is that? But if you get released into the new world, it can be very confusing.